The story that you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts, featuring characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you.
Christian K. Ross, a wealthy and well-respected gentleman, lived with his family in their large stone mansion on East Washington Lane in Germantown, a Philadelphia suburb within its corporate limits in 1874. His family consisted of his wife and 7 children named Stroughton, Harry, Sophia, Walter, Charlie, Marion, and Annie at that time. Charley Ross, 4 years old, was a chubby little fellow with long flaxen curls, and his appearance, intelligence, and disposition made him a favorite with everyone he met. His younger brother, Walter Lewis Ross, was 6 years old, and the two were inseparable. On June 27, 1874, 2 men in a buggy drove by the Ross mansion, and seeing Charlie and Walter playing on the sidewalk nearby, they stopped and engaged the children in conversation after giving them candy. Every day after that, this man drove by, always conversing with the children if they were in sight. On the afternoon of July 1st, they stopped again, and Charley Ross asked for a ride as well as candy and firecrackers to properly celebrate the approaching 4th of July. The 2 strangers quickly agreed to his demands, and Charlie and Walter were loaded into the wagon. When they got a little further, Charlie asked why they didn't stop at a store to buy the candy, but the man said they'd go to Auntie Susie's, where they could get a whole pocketful for 5 cents. When they arrived at Palmer and Richmond Streets, Walter was given 25 cents and directed to the corner store, which sold firecrackers. The kidnappers drove away with Charlie while he was making his shopping. When Walter discovered he was alone when he exited the store, he sobbed loudly. Mr. Henry Peacock was among the sympathizers who gathered around him, and he was eventually returned to his father. There were several people who saw the wagon pass when both boys were in it, but no one saw it after Walter left it, and no trace of the horse or wagon could be recovered. The reason for the abduction was initially unknown, and numerous theories were advanced. Some claimed that the favorite child was kidnapped because of family problems. Others claimed that he had fallen into the hands of gypsies, while others claimed that Mr. Ross was simply concealing the child for the purpose of gaining notoriety. On July 3rd, Mr. Ross received a letter which had been mailed in Philadelphia. The first read in part, "You will have to pay us before you get him from us, and pay us a big cent too. If you put cops hunting for him, you is only defeating your own end." When the contents of this letter became public, officials decided that extreme measures were required. A search was conducted not only in Philadelphia, but throughout the country within a radius of many miles of that city, the likes of which have rarely been conducted by American police officials, both in terms of magnitude and thoroughness. The officers felt safe ignoring the technicalities of the law in reference to searching private property, and unless they knew that the occupants of the buildings were above suspicion, the premises were searched, and any protest caused officials and neighbors to look upon the protester with suspicions. Similarly, vessels in the stream were inspected, but no trace of the missing child was discovered, despite the fact that a massive amount of stolen property was recovered and the thieves were later prosecuted. In the meantime, parents, especially of the wealthy class, had become so terrorized that they practically made prisoners of their children. On July 6, Mr. Ross received a second letter, also mailed in Philadelphia, in which the kidnappers demanded a $20,000 ransom and threatened to kill Charlie if the detectives tracked them down or their demand was not met. The letter also stated that if Mr. Ross wished to communicate with his child's custodians, he should enter a personal in the Philadelphia Ledger with the following words: "Ross, we are ready to negotiate." On July 7, Ross responded as directed, and on the same day, another letter was mailed to him, instructing him to state whether or not he would come to terms in a personal letter. It was then decided to keep answering the letters and to frame the responses in such a way that further correspondence would be required, in the hope that something would be revealed that would lead to the child's identification or that a blunder would be made that would lead to the writer's identification. Accordingly, the answer to the last letter was, Ross will come to terms to the best of his ability. On July 9th, in response to the previous personal, the kidnappers stated that they were growing impatient and that the reason for the evasive answer was obvious to them. Despite the tone of the last letter from the kidnappers, Ross continued to publish ambiguous responses, and he later declared that he would not compound a felony by paying money to the monsters who committed this heinous crime. When Ross learned of his wife's mental and physical condition, he regretted his decision and expressed a desire to reopen negotiations in the personal columns of the ledger, which elicited a response from the kidnappers, who chastised him for his rash and indiscreet actions. Sources differ on whether or not the ransom was paid. According to some, several attempts were made to hand it over to the kidnappers, but each time, the perpetrators failed to appear and claim it. Others claim that Christian Ross refused to pay the perpetrators out of fear of inciting a wave of child abductions. In any case, the kidnappers eventually stopped communicating with Charley's father. 5 months after the kidnapping, 2 men were shot while burglarizing a house in Brooklyn, bringing the case to a close. Bill Mosher died on the scene. Joe Douglas, the second robber, eventually died from his wounds. He stated before his death that he and Mosher had kidnapped Charley Ross. The witnesses were divided about what the dying man said after that. He either said Charley was murdered or that he was still alive. Nobody knows for sure, but the parents' hopes have been raised. To ensure that young Walter Ross was not influenced in any way, he was not informed of the tragedy and was instead taken to New York for an unknown purpose. When he saw the bodies, he immediately confirmed that they were the same man who had kidnapped him and Charley the summer before. Mosher's malformed nose was one of the ways he recognized him. Walter had earlier described it to the cops as a monkey nose. He recognized Mosher's remains as those of the man who drove the wagon, and when he saw Douglas's remains, he said he was the man who gave them candy. The remains were also identified by Peter Callahan, who saw the children in the wagon with the man. Mrs. Mosher was then apprehended, and while she admitted that her husband had kidnapped Charley Ross, she insisted that she had no idea where he was hiding. Mr. Ross then issued a circular in which he stated that because he was certain that the leaders of the kidnapping conspiracy had been killed, he had no desire to prosecute the parties who had his child in custody, and that he would give $5,000 as a reward to anyone who could return his boy without being questioned. On February 25, 1875, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law defining kidnapping and setting the punishment at a fine not to exceed $10,000 and solitary confinement not to exceed 25 years. But it was specifically provided that if any persons then having any kidnapped child in their possession return such child to the most accessible sheriff or magistrate prior to March 25, 1875, such persons would be immune from punishment. Despite the fact that the law guaranteed protection to anyone who returned this child and the father offered a $5,000 reward as an added incentive, the child was never seen again. Mr. Ross believed that his son was still alive, but his main reason was that Westervelt, Mosher's brother-in-law, informed him that he spoke with Douglas the day before the latter's death, and Douglas stated that Mosher was then arranging plans for the simultaneous exchange of the child and the ransom. Mr. Ross emphasized Westervelt's statement, despite Chief Walling's repeated declarations that he had conclusive evidence that the ex-policeman was assisting the kidnappers rather than the authorities. William Westervelt, who was known to associate with Bill Mosher, was the only person arrested in the case. In 1875, he was tried. While incarcerated prior to the trial, he claimed that Charley was alive at the time Mosher was murdered, but this was never proven. Westervelt, according to Walter Ross, was not one of the men who kidnapped him and his brother. The verdict in the kidnapping case was not guilty. Westervelt, on the other hand, was found guilty of conspiracy. He was imprisoned for 6 years, but maintained his innocence and claimed he had no idea where Charley Ross was. Charley's father published a book, the father's story of Charley Ross, the kidnapped child, 2 years after he was kidnapped. He hoped that the proceeds would help him continue his search for his son. The case received a lot of attention. Christian Ross later reprinted the book and lectured to raise awareness of his son's plight. He and his wife continued to look for Charley until their deaths. Christian in 1897 and his wife in 1912. Despite the family's lifelong efforts, they were unable to locate Charley. They received numerous letters and tips, and they interviewed hundreds of boys, teenagers, and grown men claiming to be Charley. According to reports, all have been proven to be imposters. Gustave Blair, who was 69 years old at that time and lived in Phoenix, Arizona, was the most successful claimant. He asked the court to recognize him as the genuine Charley Ross. He claimed he was kidnapped as a child and later adopted by a man who told him he was Charley Ross. Walter Ross was unconcerned about Blair's claim. "We've long ago given up hope that Charles would ever be found alive," he said. However, he did not challenge the claim in court, and the judge ruled that Blair was Charles Brewster Ross in 1939. Charley was not recognized by the Ross family. Blair maintained his claims until his death in 1943, and at one point tried unsuccessfully to sell his life story to a movie studio.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to say that I am incredibly grateful that you took time out of your schedule to listen to my narration. This is Nikki of Twysted Mind, wishing you a great rest of your day. Salamat.